What would you do if the flight crew told you to leave your seat because you didn't look like you belonged? What if they called security? What if you were humiliated in front of dozens of silent passengers? Now, what if you were the CEO of the airline? This is not just a story about prejudice. It's about power disguised as politeness, and a woman who refused to shrink when the world tried to erase her. On a cross-country flight, a black woman in a simple navy t-shirt quietly took her seat in first class. Within minutes, whispers started, doubts surfaced, and then the ultimate insult: she was asked to leave. But what the crew didn't know was that she wasn't just a passenger. She was the one who signed their paychecks. Why didn't she speak up right away? Why did she let them go so far? And how did she turn 7 minutes of humiliation into a moment that would shake an entire industry? Stay with us. This story will open your eyes, stir your heart, and just might change how you treat the person sitting next to you. If this kind of storytelling matters to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that reveal the soul behind the silence. Now, let's begin. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one last time. Please return to your assigned seat in economy, or we will have to escort you off this flight. The voice cut through the cabin like a razor against silk. Passengers fell silent, eyes drifting toward the source. A flight attendant, mid-30s, red lipstick smudged from stress, stood rigid near seat 1A in the first-class cabin, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her badge read Miranda Shaw, and her voice didn't waver, though it pulsed with an unmistakable chill. In seat 1A sat a petite black woman in a navy zip-up hoodie, soft gray scarf tucked loosely at her neck, and slim-fit jeans worn at the knees. She wasn't scrolling through a phone. She wasn't looking for trouble. She was simply sitting, hands clasped in her lap, eyes calm, voice quiet. "I believe you're mistaken," she said, her tone even. "This is my assigned seat." A ripple of discomfort passed through the surrounding passengers, like the murmur before a storm. Row 2's businessman, dressed in a crisp navy blazer with a Mont Blanc clipped to his shirt, leaned slightly forward. The older woman in 1B, pearl earrings dangling as she glanced sideways, clutched her designer tote a little tighter. Miranda took one step closer, lowering her voice only slightly. "Your boarding pass must be incorrect. We don't upgrade passengers without proper clearance, and this cabin is full." The woman in 1A said nothing for a moment. Then slowly, she reached into the side pocket of her worn canvas tote and retrieved a boarding pass. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, just quiet dignity. The flight attendant snatched it, scanned it quickly, and for the briefest second, there it was: hesitation. Seat 1A, first class, correct flight, correct date, correct name, Elise Rowen. Miranda's jaw clenched, but instead of backing down, she turned her attention to the uniformed flight marshal standing several rows behind. With a flick of her head, she summoned him forward. "Elise Rowen," she said aloud, projecting her voice to the back of the plane, as if announcing a criminal's name. "You are being asked to vacate your seat. This is your final notice. Still seated." Elise looked up and met her eyes. Not with defiance, not with fear, just a strange, unsettling calm. Passengers began to whisper. A few pulled out their phones, some pretending to scroll, but discreetly tapping their camera apps. One man tilted his phone just enough to frame both Miranda and Elise in the same shot. Someone muttered, "Why are they making such a big deal?" Another answered, "You know how this goes. She doesn't look like a 1A." And that's all it took. That one sentence echoed through the quiet tension, like a blade. She doesn't look like a 1A. whatever that meant. It hung at the recycled cabin, air full of judgment and poison, laced in assumption. Elise sat perfectly still. In truth, no one knew who she was, not the crew, not the passengers, and certainly not Miranda Shaw. No one knew that Elise Rowen had boarded this flight quietly, intentionally, and with a purpose no one could yet imagine. There was no press, no entourage, just her, a canvas tote, and a boarding pass on a flight operated by the very airline she ran. But right now, no one was thinking about CEO titles or corporate leadership. They were thinking about what a CEO should look like. They were thinking about blazers, not hoodies, about heels, not worn sneakers, about straight hair, not tightly braided rows tucked into a low bun. And as the uniformed marshal began to walk down the aisle toward her, Elise closed her eyes for just a moment, just a breath. This is why I came here, she thought. Then, calmly, she opened her eyes again. It had started like any other boarding. Gate 47 was busy but not chaotic. The usual blend of business suits, families wrangling toddlers, solo travelers with noise-canceling headphones already clamped on, and the quiet ones, always a few, who moved as if trying to be invisible. Elise Rowen had been one of the quiet ones. She wore no name tag, no watch, no diamond rings or designer luggage, just a canvas tote with worn seams, soft white sneakers, and a face that looked like someone's aunt, coworker, or friend from church. Not someone who signs multi-million-dollar fleet orders or gives keynote addresses at aviation summits. And that was exactly the point. She had chosen flight SC-218 departing from New York to San Francisco because it was one of the airline's most prestigious routes. This wasn't just any flight. It was a flagship journey long haul, high profile, and often packed with loyal elite travelers. And Elise needed to see it as it really was. Not from a polished video briefing, not through a polished customer satisfaction dashboard, but with her own eyes. So, she'd boarded late, intentionally. Let the others file in first. Let them interact with the crew. Let her observe. No one at the gate recognized her. That wasn't surprising. Elise Rowen kept a deliberately low profile outside press circles. Her photo wasn't on office walls or ID badges. And when she dressed down hair pulled into a braid, jeans instead of slacks, she could melt into a crowd effortlessly. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, she glanced at the SkyConnect logo on the wall. She paused for half a second, hand brushing over it like a ritual. Let me see what they don't say in the meetings, she thought. The cabin had the scent she knew: well-filtered air, citrus disinfectant, and faint synthetic leather. She greeted the first flight attendant with a polite good morning, no smile in return. The second one didn't make eye contact. Interesting. In contrast, a tall white man in business class ahead of her was greeted with a grin and welcome aboard. Mr. Dillard, champagne. Today. Elise watched the exchange quietly, heart dipping just a little, not from surprise, but confirmation. This was why she never announced herself. Her seat 1A was already fluffed and gleaming. She slid into it without fuss, keeping her bag at her feet. Around her, the first-class cabin was filling up. Women with tailored suits and silk scarves. Men with Rolexes and Bluetooth earpieces. The ritual was beginning: briefcases stowed, laptops opened, sighs of entitlement rising like steam. Elise didn't open anything. Instead, she sat with her hands clasped and her eyes quietly scanning. Her mind ran back to the dozens of emails she'd received over the past 2 years. Complaints from passengers who looked like her, or who didn't speak English fluently, or who traveled alone, with nothing but a backpack and a modest fare. They had described being ignored, questioned, or outright harassed. And yet, every time Elise brought up the issue in corporate strategy meetings, the room got tight with silence. Are we sure it's not just miscommunication? Maybe it was an isolated case. We'd hate to falsely accuse a loyal crew member. She had heard all the excuses. Every soft dodge dressed up as concern. That's why she was here now, on this flight. Quiet, present, watching. Across the aisle, a well-dressed woman had dropped her boarding pass. Elise instinctively reached out to pick it up. The woman gave a curt nod, no words, then clutched her purse tighter. Elise leaned back, swallowing the bitterness. If they knew who I was, she thought, would they offer me wine? Would they smile? Would they call me Miss Rowen and offer extra pillows? But she already knew the answer. It wasn't about who she was. It was about what she looked like, and the fact that she chose to come without armor, no press badge. No tailored suit meant she'd get the unfiltered truth. Her fingers drummed against her tote bag softly. This was only the beginning. It started with coffee. Not the coffee itself, but how it was served. From the corner of her eye, Elise Rowen watched as the flight attendant Miranda Shaw, the same one who would soon try to have her removed, glided down the first-class aisle like a catwalk judge in pressed polyester. She had just offered a tall, older white man in seat 1C a French press sample and a choice of almond or oat milk. When she passed Elise in 1A, nothing, no offer, no glance, not even the silent nod she gave to others. Elise watched the small gesture float by her like vapor, meaningless to some, but deeply telling to those who've lived long enough in skin like hers. Small things, she thought, that's where the truth lives, and the small things kept coming. The man in 2B asked for a second pillow. Miranda returned with 2 and a blanket. The younger white woman in 1D said she was cold. A flight attendant named Jacob Lee brought a SkyConnect branded cardigan and a bottle of still water room temperature, as she preferred. Then, an Asian couple in their late 60s stepped into the cabin, looking around with soft confusion. The husband's steps were slow, cautious, as he tried to read the overhead signs. His wife held tightly onto his arm, whispering something in their native language. Jacob's tone shifted when he approached them. "Sir, I need you to step aside. We're boarding Group 4 now." The man smiled and tried to hold out their boarding passes. Jacob didn't even take them. Instead, he motioned to the back. "I said Group 4. This is priority boarding. You're not cleared for this section." The woman said something again, trying to explain. Jacob didn't answer. He turned, annoyed, and waved over another crew member to handle it. Elise's jaw tightened slightly. From her seat, she could see the way the couple's shoulders slumped as they shuffled down the aisle, clearly embarrassed. Even though they'd followed instructions, they just weren't recognized. Moments later, a sharply dressed white man with salt and pepper hair strolled on board carrying no boarding pass, no ID, just a leather portfolio and swagger. Miranda rushed to meet him. "Mr. Kavanaugh." She beamed. "Your usual seat. 1B is ready. Would you like your espresso now, or after takeoff?" They laughed like old friends. Elise looked out the window. Recognition had nothing to do with facts, only with faces. Then came the younger woman, mid-20s, red hair, yoga set, oversized headphones perched on her neck. She stumbled into the aisle late, holding an iced coffee and a phone she never looked up from. Jacob grinned. "Running late again?" "Huh. Clara." She giggled. "Don't judge me. I didn't even pack." He chuckled and walked her to her seat personally. Need help with your bag? Only if you'll carry me too, she teased. Elise raised an eyebrow. It was a performance, one that told a very clear story about who was welcome, who was served, and who was other. It wasn't that Elise expected special treatment. She didn't want extra attention. She just wanted the same dignity, the same tone of voice, the same warmth, the same assumption of belonging. From across the cabin, Elise noticed a woman in uniform, Officer Kent, the in-flight security, lean against the back bulkhead, arms folded, eyes scanning, but not in a protective way, in a suspicious way. He lingered longer on passengers who looked like they'd saved for months for this flight, on the young man in a hoodie with a backpack, on the black mother 2 rows behind Elise trying to settle her infant, and when Elise locked eyes with him, just for a second, he looked away. Not embarrassed, alerted. That was enough. She reached into her tote and quietly pulled out her notepad. The page was mostly blank, but soon it began to fill. Row numbers, timestamps, names, not because she needed revenge, but because she needed evidence. Elise had spent years fighting for inclusion, for accountability, but data alone wouldn't move hearts. Stories would, and she was writing one now, seat by seat, glance by glance. Her heart felt heavier than usual, not with anger, but weariness. She'd known it wouldn't be easy, but sitting among the unkind smiles, the polite neglect, the unspoken hierarchy, it stung more than she'd let herself admit. Her fingers tightened on the pen. Just then, a flight attendant walked by. Not Miranda, a younger one. He paused, looked down at her, hesitated, then moved on. No offer, no greeting, as if her seat were unoccupied. Elise breathed in slowly. So this is what it feels like. Not to be denied violently, just quietly erased. She hadn't planned to cry on this flight. But now, as the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff and the hum of the engines began to rise, Elise Rowen felt a weight pressing against her chest, not from fear, not from altitude, but from everything she'd seen in just under 40 minutes. The silence, the favoritism, the way her presence in seat 1A had triggered discomfort before a single word had been spoken. How many others had felt this same invisible weight? She turned her head slightly, gazing through the small oval window as the runway blurred beneath them. Her reflection in the glass was faint, soft eyes, tired lines beneath them, her hair braided into a neat row wrapped low. A simple woman in a hoodie, carrying a name no one cared to read on a boarding pass. But that name mattered, because behind that name was a purpose, one that went far beyond being CEO of SkyConnect Airlines. Months ago, she'd sat in a strategy meeting on the 47th floor of the SkyConnect headquarters in Manhattan. The room was glass, sleek, with skyline views. Everything was polished. Everyone wore suits. The conversation had turned to customer experience. A director had pulled up a presentation, a tidy chart with satisfaction metrics, neat little bars in blue and green. We're holding at 87% overall positive feedback, he'd said confidently. First-class scores are excellent. Elise had leaned forward. What about disparities? Disparities, he echoed, puzzled. She nodded. Any difference in experience based on demographic? A brief silence. Then someone else spoke. Cautious. We've had some isolated complaints, but nothing systemic. That word isolated stuck in her mind like a splinter, because in her private inbox, there had been dozens of messages, not from angry customers demanding refunds, but from quietly hurt ones. Passengers who had felt invisible, unwelcome, judged. A Nigerian professor who'd been asked to show his boarding pass twice while walking through business class. A Latina nurse who'd been told she looked lost near the premium gate. A black father whose autistic son wasn't offered the same courtesy kit given to nearby passengers. Each one described the same thing. They looked at me like I didn't belong. And Elise had thought, if I weren't the one signing these checks, would they look at me the same way? Now, thousands of feet above the ground, she was living the answer. A part of her had hoped she'd be wrong, hoped that what she'd seen in her inbox wasn't systemic, just unlucky stories from tired days. But here she was, being ignored, doubted, and watched all in silence. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for the hundreds of passengers every week who boarded SkyConnect flights without the protection of a title, without the voice to push back, without someone watching their story unfold. She pulled her canvas tote up onto her lap and unzipped the inner pocket. Inside was a slim leather notebook, unmarked. No logo. In it were the flight numbers she had chosen for this anonymous journey. Notes about previous incidents. Crew members she'd been quietly observing across multiple routes. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned, intentional, structured like a quiet investigation. Elise had made a decision long ago. Before I challenged them, I must witness it myself. She'd stepped into this plane not just as CEO, but as every person who had been brushed aside. Yet even with all that conviction, doubt had a way of sneaking in. A quiet voice in her mind whispered, what if nothing changes? What if they never believe the quiet stories? What if they always look through you, no matter how many seats you pay for, no matter what title you hold? Elise clenched her fingers around the notebook, then slowly breathed out. She couldn't afford to give in to that voice. Not today, not on this flight, because even if this ended in silence, she would leave with her eyes wide open, with her evidence, with her truth. And sometimes that was how revolutions began, not with shouts, not with protests, but with witnessing, with choosing to see what others denied. The plane was cruising smoothly now. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers reclined their seats. Headphones came on. Some began asking for wine. No one asked Elise if she needed anything. Not Miranda. Not Jacob. Not anyone. She jotted that down in her notebook. Page 3. Ignored again during initial service. She tucked the book away, and as the clouds rolled past outside her window, Elise Rowen closed her eyes not to sleep, but to gather strength, because the moment of truth was coming. And this time, the quiet woman in seat 1A wouldn't stay quiet for long. The first time Miranda Shaw approached her, it was with a strained smile and forced professionalism. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, voice clipped but neutral. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Elise Rowen looked up from her notebook, eyes clear, breath calm. She reached into her tote without a word and handed over the same slip she had presented at boarding. It still said, Seat 1A Flight SC218 Passenger Elise Rowen Miranda glanced at it, lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't return the smile. She didn't thank her. She simply held it a moment too long, like it might somehow reveal a hidden trick, and then walked away. Elise exhaled slowly. Strike one. 15 minutes later, Miranda was back this time with Jacob Lee beside her. "We're sorry," Jacob said with a practiced gentleness, "but there appears to be a discrepancy. We've had a duplicate scan for this seat." Elise raised an eyebrow. "You scanned it at the gate." "I was cleared by the system." "Yes. Well," Miranda interjected, "sometimes mistakes happen. Are you sure you're in the right section of the plane?" Elise didn't flinch. "I am. Seat 1A. Purchased 6 weeks ago. You're welcome to check the manifest." That should have ended it. But it didn't. Instead, Jacob offered a brittle smile. We may need you to step into the galley just for a moment. We're trying to resolve this privately." Elise's heart thudded once, not from fear, but from the bitter familiarity of it all. The request to step aside, the suggestion that she was somehow out of place, the implication that she was the disruption. "I'm comfortable resolving it here," she said softly, but firmly. "I'm in my assigned seat, and until someone with authority tells me otherwise, I will remain here." The silence between them stretched. Then Jacob stiffened. "We'll notify the flight supervisor." 15 rows behind her, passengers began to murmur. "What's going on? Is there a problem with her ticket?" One woman leaned toward her husband. "She's not dressed like the others up here." That might be it. That sentence sliced through the air sharper than Miranda's voice ever could. Not dressed like them, as if clothing were the only passport to dignity, as if presence alone wasn't enough. Elise sat still, posture perfect, eyes forward. She'd trained herself for moments like this for rooms that doubted her, meetings that questioned her expertise, award ceremonies where they assumed she was the assistant, not the recipient. But this was different, because this was her plane, her airline. And still, they saw her as a threat to comfort. A few moments later, Officer Kent, the in-flight security officer, made his way to the first-class cabin, his posture stiff, his badge prominent, his eyes already judgmental. "Ma'am," he said, deep voiced low, "we've had a report that this seat may be assigned incorrectly. I'm going to need to see your ID." Elise didn't move right away. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. "They've decided I'm a problem," she thought. "They've skipped doubt and gone straight to suspicion." She looked up. "I've already shown my boarding pass twice. It matches the manifest. But if you'd like my ID, here it is." She handed him her license, Elise Rowen. Photo clear, address matching the SkyConnect Executive Registry. Kent took it and walked a few steps away, as if needing distance to process the enormity of the truth in front of him. Elise closed her eyes briefly. The soft hum of the engine was still steady, but the hum in her chest, the one of decades of restraint, was beginning to grow louder. Then it happened. A passenger boarded late. An older white woman in a pastel cardigan stepped up the aisle, clearly agitated. Her voice was high, haughty. "I believe someone is in my seat." "It's 1A. That's what my assistant confirmed." Miranda turned toward her like a sunflower to the sun. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, we're terribly sorry about the confusion. We'll get it resolved immediately. And then," Miranda turned to Elise, "Ma'am, this seat was reserved for a VIP guest. Please gather your things." Something in Elise's face shifted. Not rage, not panic resolve. She spoke quietly, but the firmness in her voice carried to the rows beyond. "I purchased this seat weeks ago. I boarded legally. I've shown my ID and boarding pass multiple times. I will not be moving." Miranda leaned in slightly, voice sharp. "You're making a scene." Elise didn't blink. "You made the scene. I'm simply not leaving it." Officer Kent returned and handed Elise's ID back like it was radioactive. "She checks out," he said, almost reluctantly. But Miranda wasn't done. She straightened her shoulders and looked Elise directly in the eye. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call in ground security when we land." Elise nodded once, then reached into her tote bag, calmly, and pulled out a small, old phone. Not the newest model, not the one executives usually flaunted, but it was charged and loaded with one number on speed dial. She tapped it once, held it to her ear. The ring was soft, measured. Then a man answered, Julian Vance. Elise's words were steady. "Julian, this is Elise. I'm on flight SE288. I'm currently being denied my seat despite full documentation. Please intervene immediately." The air changed. Miranda's face paled. Jacob glanced sideways. Officer Kent shifted uncomfortably. The name Julian Vance was familiar. Executive level. COO of SkyConnect. Wait. Elise passengers nearby froze. Some were already filming. Others whispered. And Miranda. Her hands dropped slowly to her sides, the authority draining from her posture like water down a sink. Elise placed the phone face up on the tray table, turned on speaker mode, and folded her hands again. "I'd like everyone to hear this. Elise." The voice of Julian Vance, CEO of SkyConnect Airlines, crackled over the speakerphone. Tight, controlled, concerned. "You're on board flight SC208 right now." Every sound in the cabin seemed to disappear. No one clicked a seatbelt. No one sipped their wine. All ears tuned in. Passengers leaned across aisles. Phones were raised, screens glowing softly in the dimmed first-class cabin. Eyes darted between the phone on Elise's tray table and the woman they'd just labeled as a mistaken intruder. "Yes," Elise replied calmly. "And I've just been told by both the flight crew and in-flight security that I do not belong in the seat I purchased. Despite documentation, they attempted to remove me." A pause, not more than a breath long. Then Julian's tone shifted from inquiry to command. "I want you to stay exactly where you are. Do not move. I'm alerting the entire executive chain and engaging our legal and ethics division. You are not to be touched." Miranda Shaw, who had stood like a statue for the past 30 seconds, opened her mouth but no words came out. Her throat visibly contracted. Jacob Lee lowered his eyes and took a quiet step backward. Officer Kent cleared his throat and looked everywhere but at Elise. "Who exactly is she a passenger?" whispered to another. "Their phone's still recording." "She sounds important." Elise didn't answer the questions in the air. She didn't have to. Her voice remained low, measured. But what followed turned the entire flight on its head. "Julian," she said into the phone, eyes still locked on Miranda. "Please remind everyone who I am." Another silence. "Then this is Elise Rowen, Chief Executive Officer of SkyConnect Airlines," Julian said, voice flat and undeniable. "She leads our global aviation operations, is the highest-ranking officer in this company, and is the one person on this aircraft with the authority to fire every employee on board if she sees fit." A gasp rippled through the cabin, a soft one from 2B, a louder one from the older woman still standing with her ticket in hand. Mrs. Whitmore, previously puffed up with expectation, looked as if someone had yanked the air right out of her. She staggered backward, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. "No, that's not possible," Miranda whispered, eyes darting toward the passengers now filming her from 3 angles. Elise didn't move, didn't blink, but something in her gaze so calm, so still, told the whole room, it is not only possible, it's happening. The moment cracked open. One by one, passengers began to shift. The man in 1C set down his drink. The woman behind Elise tapped her friend and whispered, "She's the CEO of the whole airline." A younger man across the aisle said loudly, "Damn." They were about to kick her off. A few people actually applauded. It wasn't loud. It wasn't celebratory. It was stunned, polite, and laced with something else entirely recognition. For who she was, and what she had endured, Miranda stepped back finally, her jaw slack. She looked to Officer Kent for support. He turned to her and murmured, You said she didn't belong in 1A, that she was an irregular booking. I didn't know. You didn't check. I assumed. But the sentence hung unfinished. Even she couldn't finish it. Elise picked up the phone gently and brought it closer. Julian, I need one more thing. Yes. Record this call. Loop in our general counsel and pull the cabin's security footage starting from boarding. You've got it, he said. Legal is already on standby. Then she added, and put the ethics team on alert. We're going to make this public. That sentence that broke the spell. Phones were now visibly filming. Passengers were whispering, some nodding, others staring with renewed admiration. And Miranda, she finally backed away, nearly bumping into the galley wall. Her face was no longer red with authority. It was pale, empty, and full of the realization that she had made the biggest mistake of her career. Elise set the phone down once more, lifted her eyes, and surveyed the cabin not with fury, but with focus. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman quietly reclaiming every inch of space she had been denied. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with the kind of dignity that makes silence itself turn into an ally. For nearly 10 seconds after Julian Vance's voice faded from the speakerphone, no one in first class moved. No clinking glasses, no keyboard clicks, not even a cough. The stillness was total. Elise Rowen, CEO of SkyConnect Airlines, sat calmly in seat 1A. Her hands were folded gently, her shoulders relaxed, but the look in her eyes focused, unwavering, cut through the air like lightning without thunder. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence was a protest. Her posture was a declaration. And that alone began to shift the balance of the entire plane. Miranda Shaw stepped back into the galley, her hand shaking as she reached for the intercom, then stopped. She looked down, realizing she had nothing left to announce, nothing left to say. She had just tried to evict the most powerful person on this flight, on the entire airline, from her rightful seat, simply because Elise didn't look like the power they were trained to serve. And now everyone knew it. Jacob Lee, beside her, sat on the fold-down jump seat and quietly removed his name badge. His face had gone completely slack. Back in the aisle, Mrs. Whitmore attempted to retreat to 1C. Her earlier indignation drained, but no one looked at her the same anymore. Her privilege had been publicly deflated, and no amount of pearls could protect her from it. Then, from the seat behind Elise, a soft voice broke the silence. I just want to say, a middle-aged woman with short curls and a gentle southern accent began. I saw what happened, and I'm sorry. Elise turned slightly, eyes meeting hers with surprise. I've flown this airline for years, the woman continued. I've never seen someone treated like that in first class. Then another voice, younger, male, that was straight-up bias. If you'd looked like me, they wouldn't have said a word. He held up his phone. It's all recorded. One by one, people began to speak, some with quiet shame, some with burning anger, but all of them finally looking at Elise with clarity. Elise slowly rose from her seat, not out of performance, but because her body could no longer contain the truth inside her. She turned toward the front of the cabin, her voice low but steady. I didn't come on this flight to test anyone, she said. I didn't come to catch anyone off guard. I came because I wanted to see with my own eyes what so many passengers have been quietly telling us for years. Her gaze swept the room. I came as myself, not as a title, not as a brand, just as a traveler, in clothes I'm comfortable in. I boarded with a valid pass. I followed every procedure, and still, I was treated as a threat. The cabin stayed silent. You could hear the tension shift into remorse. I've read hundreds of complaints, Elise continued. Some ignored, some downplayed, most dismissed as customer error. She lifted the small leather notebook from her tote. In here are pages of stories, from people like the elderly couple who were told to wait, the single mother who got passed over for blankets, the foreign graduate student whose seat was given away before he could argue. She flipped the pages once. I don't carry these because I want to fire people. She paused. I carry them because I want to fix something. At the back of the plane, a flight attendant not involved in the earlier conflict stood frozen in the aisle. Her hand covered her mouth. In row 6, a teenage girl wiped a tear quietly. In row 2, a businessman folded his laptop closed and whispered, "This is what leadership looks like." "I'm not here to punish," Elise said softly, "but I will hold people accountable. And I will not accept a culture on this flight or in this company that equates professionalism with whiteness, or power with a polished accent, or value with a designer suit." She looked toward the galley. "Because dignity," she said, "has nothing to do with dress code." The words didn't echo loudly. They didn't need to. They settled into the carpet, into the leather of the seats, into the hearts of everyone listening. And something else shifted in that moment. The atmosphere stopped being just about Elise. It became about every person on that plane and what kind of world they were helping to create. The flight attendant call button dinged softly, but no one moved. All eyes were on Elise Rowen, still standing in the aisle of first class. Her notebook closed now, her voice having settled the air into something far more fragile than silence. It wasn't just attention anymore. It was reckoning. From the galley, Miranda Shaw stepped forward again. Her posture had shifted. Gone was the prideful stride, the clipped chin, in its place stiff shoulders, blinking eyes, a kind of forced composure that couldn't hide the shakiness beneath. "I didn't know," she began, barely audible. "I didn't realize who you were." Elise turned toward her. "But you saw me. You looked at me and decided what I wasn't. You didn't ask questions. You assumed. And then you tried to make me disappear quietly, because I didn't fit the profile you expect in this cabin." Miranda's mouth opened, then closed again, behind her. Jacob Lee shifted awkwardly. He still hadn't spoken. "I followed protocol," he offered weakly. Elise met his eyes with something gentler than fury, but sharper than disappointment. "No, you followed pattern, and you used it like a shield." A few rows behind, a man whispered to his wife, "She's not yelling. She's not shaming. She's just telling the truth." In row 3, a younger crew member stood silently near the curtain divider, his hands wringing together, eyes wet. Elise returned her attention to Miranda. "I've made it very clear in this company that implicit bias is not just a training module," she said. "It's a daily reality that must be unlearned, rewritten." Her voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that carried the full weight of consequences. "Miranda Shaw," she said, steady and direct. "You are relieved of your duties for the remainder of this flight. You'll report to the ethics and compliance team upon landing." Miranda's breath hitched. "But I've been." "This isn't about your record," Elise interrupted gently. "It's about your behavior." She looked at Jacob next. "You stood beside it. You nodded. You never once questioned what you were seeing." He looked down. "You're suspended pending internal review. Officer Kent," standing stiff near the bulkhead, stepped forward suddenly. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he began, I was acting on crew instructions. I didn't know I don't need you to know who I am. Elise replied, I needed you to treat me like a person, not a problem. Her gaze didn't waver. You are also suspended. You'll speak with aviation security and HR in person. Kent's jaw clenched, but he said nothing else. And then, Elise turned to the entire cabin. You all just witnessed something we rarely acknowledge in public, she said. A bias not shouted, not explicit, but practiced in posture, in tone, in the way power decides who is welcome and who is not. She let the words settle like dust. And this isn't just about me. It's about the countless people who've sat in these very seats or tried to and were made to feel lesser because of how they looked, what they wore, what language they spoke. A few heads nodded, a few eyes welled, a few hearts finally opened. I believe in accountability, she continued, but not revenge. So to those still working on this flight, the ones who stood frozen or uncertain, you still have time to choose the right side. Speak up. Learn. Change. That's all I've ever asked. A voice broke the moment. It was Amy Tran, a younger crew member standing behind the galley curtain. Her voice trembled, but she raised it anyway. I saw it all, and I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry. Another pause, then a murmur from the rear. A tall man and coach a black passenger in a polo shirt stood up and spoke through the curtain. I've flown this airline for 6 years. Never seen something like this. Not the problem. The solution. The cabin shifted again, not just in sound, but in energy. Applause didn't come like thunder. It came like rainfall, soft, steady, honest. Elise nodded once, then sat back down in 1A. And for the first time that flight, someone brought her a bottle of water. No labels, no fanfare, just a quiet gesture of respect. She took it, not as a gift, but as a signal. The tide was turning. From the moment Elise Rowen sat back in her seat, the world outside the aircraft began to shift. It started small. A subtle ping on someone's phone, in row 5. Hey, isn't this the woman from the SkyConnect homepage? Then a tweet, just watched a black woman get harassed by flight crew for sitting in first class. Turns out she's the CEO of the airline, and she handled it like a boss. Was flight SC2 for SkyConnect. And another that moment when you try to remove the CEO from her own seat within 5 minutes. The hashtags were trending. Within 15. The corporate communications team at SkyConnect's headquarters was flooded with press alerts. And at the top floor of the glass-paneled building in Manhattan, the executive boardroom erupted into motion. Julian Vance, still on the line with the internal ethics team, paced the length of the room. On the screen behind him, live updates from Flight SC218's internal camera feed, time-stamped and stored. Where's legal, he demanded. Looping them in now. What about PR? We've drafted 3 statements, a junior assistant replied, but none feel strong enough. Julian turned toward the window, watching the skyline blur in the late afternoon haze. She doesn't want a statement, he said. She wants change. And she's going to show everyone how it's done. Back in the sky. Elise sipped her water slowly. For the first time since boarding, she felt her hands relax. Not because justice had fully arrived, but because the tide was now undeniably moving. Across the aisle, the woman from 1D, a young lawyer in an emerald pantsuit, spoke softly. Ms. Rowen, may I ask you something? Elise turned gently. Yes. The woman hesitated, then leaned in. Why didn't you stop them sooner? When you had the power? Elise paused, then said, Simply because I needed to see how far they'd go when they believed I had none. The lawyer sat back slowly, her eyes wide not in shock, but in understanding. Down the aisle, a few more passengers had started writing in journals. Others whispered about the footage they'd taken, some already uploaded, some waiting for permission to share. One man, a tech analyst in his late 20s, posted a video with the caption, "Elise Rowen is what leadership looks like. Calm, relentless, human. We need more like her in boardrooms and cockpits." By the time the plane crossed into its final hour of flight, news outlets were already calling the event the 30,000-foot reckoning. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, the atmosphere had changed as well. Where there had once been whispers of discomfort, now there was a kind of quiet reverence. People smiled when she passed to stretch her legs. Some nodded with respect. One woman, an older black nurse returning from visiting her granddaughter, reached out gently and pressed Elise's hand when she walked by. "I've waited my whole life to see someone like you, not just in that seat, but standing tall in it." Elise smiled, voice soft. "You shouldn't have had to wait this long." Then came the message from the cockpit. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker, formal but shaken. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. I'd like to thank you for your patience and understanding today. We've had an unusual situation on board, one that, I believe, has taught us all something important." He paused. "On behalf of the crew and SkyConnect, I extend our sincerest apologies to Ms. Elise Rowen, our CEO, and to anyone who has ever felt unseen aboard one of our flights. Change is already underway." There was no applause, just a deep, quiet inhale across the cabin, the kind people take before something new begins. Elise returned to her seat and stared out the window. The clouds had thinned. Below them, the city was beginning to glow, rooftops catching the amber light of late afternoon, cars like flickering dots on the veins of a restless world. In her lap, her phone buzzed softly. A message from Julian headquarters is watching, and so is the world. "We're ready when you are." Elise stared at those words for a moment, then tapped a reply with one hand, her other resting gently on the edge of her notebook. "I'm not coming back to issue a press release. I'm coming back to rewrite the manual." The wheels touched down on the tarmac with a soft thud. A familiar sigh swept through the cabin, the collective exhale of arrival. But this time, it wasn't just about reaching a destination. For Elise Rowen, it was about what came next. The seatbelt sign chimed off. The overhead lights brightened. People sat still, not because they were tired, but because no one wanted to be the first to move, not after what they had witnessed, not after seeing a woman walk a quiet line between restraint and revolution, between grace and fire. Miranda Shaw had already removed her name badge. She remained in the galley, silent, her shoulders hunched. Jacob Lee didn't speak. He simply busied himself checking compartments, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. And Officer Kent, once so confident, now stood near the cockpit door, arms crossed tightly, not out of defiance, but self-protection. As the cabin door opened, the first-class curtain was pulled aside, and on the jet bridge stood two people in tailored suits. Lisa Colburn, SkyConnect Senior VP of Ethics, and Mark Denham, Head of Legal Affairs. Both held tablets. Both had already seen the footage. And both looked straight at Elise not as a subordinate, not as a myth, but with the respect reserved for someone who had just rewritten an industry rulebook from 30,000 feet. "Elise," Lisa said gently, "we're ready whenever you are." Elise stood slowly, not as a performance, but with the kind of measured stillness that made every passenger around her sit up straighter. As she moved forward down the aisle, the murmurs returned, but they were different now. Respectful. Awed. A woman in coach whispered, "Thank you." A teenager pressed their hands together in gratitude. A man in business class gave a solemn nod, whispering, "You spoke for all of us." At the end of the jet bridge stood a wall of cameras, news crews, reporters, airline bloggers, even a few stunned employees from corporate. Phones were up, mics were pointed forward, and somewhere beyond the flashing lights, the headlines were already being typed. SkyConnect CEO faces discrimination on her own flight and responds with poise and policy. Black woman denied first-class seating. Turns out, she runs the airline. Julian Vance waited just behind the reporters. His phone buzzed every 12 seconds. He didn't look up until Elise stepped beside him. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Elise nodded, then turned toward the podium. Someone had rushed into place. She didn't grab it. She didn't clutch the microphone. Instead, she stepped in front of it. No notes, no press team, just the truth. "I wasn't going to speak yet," she said, her voice amplified but calm. "I thought I would go back to the office, review the footage, issue a private correction. But what happened on flight SC-218 wasn't just about me, and it wasn't just private." She paused. "Because discrimination never is." Reporters leaned forward. Passengers behind her, many still in the cabin doorway, stood shoulder to shoulder, listening again. "I sat in a seat I purchased, legally, quietly, and I was questioned, delayed, removed from service, and nearly removed from the flight." She scanned the crowd. No one raised their voice. No one used a slur. But that doesn't mean it wasn't violence. It was the kind of polite exclusion that people of color, especially women, know too well. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued, steady. "I was made invisible while fully present, erased without being touched. That's not a boarding mistake. That's a culture problem." Gasps, pen scratching, cameras flashing. One reporter called out, "Are you planning to take action?" Elise nodded. "Yes, effective immediately. The staff involved have been relieved of duty and placed under investigation. But more than that, SkyConnect will implement a third-party civil rights audit across all departments." Another voice. "Are you stepping down?" "No," she said, and then smiled slightly. "I'm stepping forward. For every person who has ever been made to feel like a trespasser in a space they paid to be in, I am not resigning, I am rebuilding." A wave of stunned applause broke out not from the press, but from the passengers behind her, who had followed her off the plane. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with pride in their stance. But all of them now stood not behind a CEO but beside a woman who refused to disappear. By the time the evening news aired, the footage had gone viral. 4 angles, 1 voice, 1,000 truths finally heard. Clips of Elise Rowen sitting silently, calmly placing her phone on the tray table. Her soft but firm tone as she said, "Please remind them who I am." The wide-eyed stares as Julian Vance's voice echoed through the cabin, declaring her the CEO of SkyConnect. Those images looped again and again from CNN to TikTok, from aviation blogs to major civil rights networks. One news anchor's voiceover summarized it all today. America witnessed not just the reality of discrimination, but what it looks like when power is held with grace, when restraint becomes resistance, and when a leader reclaims her seat without ever raising her voice. Inside SkyConnect's Manhattan headquarters, the ripple became a wave. The ethics team launched an internal investigation. Over 700 employee messages flooded HR, some defensive, many apologetic, most reflective. Stockholders called in, not with concern about shares, but with praise for Elise's stance. And Elise, She was already one step ahead. She sat alone in the conference room late into the night. Sleeves rolled up, shoes off, glasses perched on the edge of her nose. Before her, a wall-sized whiteboard. Written across the top, in permanent marker. This isn't a PR crisis. It's a cultural reset. From there, she mapped it out. Mandatory equity and empathy training, not once a year, but every quarter. A new passenger equity committee, with diverse voices from actual travelers, not just executives. Full access to internal complaint records for every department head and measurable action taken within 30 days. Surprise undercover evaluations, with executives posing as everyday passengers, just like she had. Anonymous peer review assessments of crew conduct, tied directly to promotions and pay. Language bias protocols, training on how tone, appearance, and attitude are interpreted across cultures. Julian entered the room just after midnight. He found her staring at the board, one finger tapping her chin. "You're rewriting the whole company." "No," she said. "I'm making it reflect what we claimed we were all along." Julian stepped closer. "You're going to make enemies." Elise looked at him, no fear in her eyes. Then they were never allies. The next morning, Elise released her first open letter. It didn't start with corporate language. It started with a sentence that stopped people in their tracks I've known for a long time. That power doesn't protect you, especially when you look like me. She wrote not as CEO, but as a daughter, a mother, a black woman, a traveler, someone who had felt the sting of being second-guessed, of being followed through stores, of being asked to prove herself 3 times more than anyone else. Her final paragraph read, "I was removed from service, not because I broke the rules, but because I quietly refused to shrink. I will not let that silence define my airline. The cabin, the crew, the culture, everything is on the table, because no passenger should ever feel like a trespasser again." The letter was read aloud on morning radio shows. It was printed on the front page of 3 major newspapers, and, most impactfully, it was emailed to every SkyConnect employee, followed by an invite. "This Friday, join me on flight SC-01. One crew, one mission. Let's fly differently." That invitation spread like wildfire. Employees across the country volunteered to be on that flight. Passengers booked every seat in minutes. Reporters fought for a spot. But Elise wasn't staging a media event. She was creating a mirror and daring everyone to look into it. That Friday, when passengers boarded flight SE-01, they didn't see suits and ranks and badges. They saw executives in jeans and polos. They saw HR directors helping store bags. They saw captains offering water to passengers. They saw Elise Rowen, seated in 12B, coach, middle seat, smiling quietly, watching, learning, changing the altitude of leadership not from the cockpit, but from beside the people. Flight SM cruised above the clouds, not just in altitude and meaning. Inside the aircraft, something rare was happening. Real listening, real equality, real accountability. Elise Rowen, CEO of SkyConnect Airlines, sat in seat 12B, wedged between a school teacher from Baltimore and a retired mechanic from Phoenix. There was no fanfare, no VIP tray, no special announcement, just her, a woman reclaiming what leadership should look like. Throughout the flight, people took turns quietly thanking her. Some wrote notes on napkins. Others asked to shake her hand. But Elise never stood up to make a speech. Instead, she listened to stories of being misgendered by gate agents, to tales of how language barriers led to unnecessary suspicion, to how uniforms often determined respect or the lack of it. She scribbled in her leather notebook, page after page. This wasn't publicity. It was policy in the making. When the wheels finally touched down on the runway in Atlanta, passengers stayed seated even after the chime. One man in 15A called out, "Ma'am, thank you for making room where there wasn't any." Elise smiled. This time, she didn't just nod. She stood slowly and turned to the cabin. Her voice didn't need amplification. The entire aircraft leaned in. "I boarded this flight not as a CEO, but as a reminder." She began. "That change doesn't come when we ask for it quietly. It comes when we show up as we are and refuse to be erased." Heads nodded, eyes shimmered. She continued, "I didn't ground that plane 2 weeks ago to prove I was important. I did it because for too long, people have been grounded before they ever left the runway." She paused, choosing her words with precision. Every crew member, every gate agent, every customer has value. But no one's dignity should ever be decided by their seat number, skin tone, or suitcase. Then came her final words. "I don't want to be remembered for stopping a flight. I want to be remembered for starting a better journey. And I hope, if you're flying with us again, you'll help me keep this promise in the air." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't ask for applause. But applause came anyway. From coach to first class, the entire plane filled with steady, heartfelt clapping, not just for Elise, but for the possibility that something real was beginning to rise, not just in the skies, but across every space where bias once flew unchecked. What started as an ordinary flight turned into something unforgettable. Not because of turbulence, not because of delays, but because one woman dared to stay seated when the world demanded she move. Elise Rowen didn't raise her voice. She didn't seek revenge. She stood in quiet, resolute dignity and showed us what true leadership looks like. She reminded us that discrimination doesn't always wear a uniform or shout across a room. Sometimes it hides behind polite smiles in who gets offered a drink first or who's asked to prove they belong. And while she grounded a crew, she lifted a generation. So if you've ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever watched someone else be pushed aside, or if you simply believe that respect should never depend on appearance, then let this story live on through you. Speak up, see people, and never underestimate the strength of someone sitting quietly in seat 12B. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel, because the next story might just be yours, and we'll be right here to help it take flight.